Hello everyone, welcome to SAW Dialogues 2022, presented by Art and Market in partnership with National Arts Council Singapore as part of the 10th edition of Singapore Art Week. My name is Nadia Wang and I'm editor at Art and Market. It's great to have all of you here with us on the live stream. On the screen now is a QR code that you can scan to access Slido for the Q&A segment. Feel free to type in a question at any time and we will get to as many of them as possible at the end of the talk. Since you're with us online, you can turn on the automatic live caption function by clicking on the CC button on your video player. And I would now like to introduce the talk for the evening, co-presented with Singapore Art Museum. The pandemic has forced a quantum leap experiment on the world, leaving us with much to process about humanity in a digital age. Physical isolation forced relationships into a virtual medium. In this moment of the great pivot, we have the opportunity to design the future of culture and community in a way that serves the human being holistically, taking into account that we are social beings that can only function when our emotional needs are met as we communicate. How do we design them for the most productive and innovative future that addresses the needs of our society as it is today and not what it used to be? Join Itamar Kubovy, Dr. Khoo Eng Tat, and Dr. Lim Chye Hong as they share their experiences in navigating the digital realms to optimize live, five senses, and in-person experience. The key focus being how to rethink cultural programming as a primary tool to activate a sense of community, trust, and belonging. Chye Hong, over to you.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, everybody, for being with us tonight. It's with great pleasure that I introduce the speaker tonight. Itamar, a good friend, and I've known him for years, and he is a great guy who manages theaters in Germany and Sweden. And on top of that, he has been executive producer for the very, very globally acclaimed dance company Globalist for many, many years. He also co-founded and co-led Insight Life, an online resource by the Freeman Event Company. And most recently, he has launched the Decameron Row, which is a virtual street of hundreds of windows where artists from around the world share 1-minute videos, postcards, work in isolation. Next, I have Eng Tat. Eng Tat, I've also known him for many years. We can't quite remember how we met, but we continue to stay in touch. And he's a senior lecturer at the Engineering, Design and Innovation Center and principal investigator at the Immersive Reality Lab at the University of Singapore. His research focuses on virtual, augmented and mixed reality, including human-computer interaction. And so tonight, I'm very, very delighted to have the two of them to talk about this idea of rethinking cultural programming as a tool to activate community and belonging. And one of the things that actually started this conversation was this idea of the pandemic, in the sense that has forced us to actually embrace digital platform in one way or another. And this talk would not have been possible if the digital platform hasn't become so prevalent at this point in time. So I would like to start with Itamar to maybe tell us a little bit about his role in, his experience in kind of a pandemic-driven New York, because he's coming from us from New York City, and how does programming, in a sense, have changed for him from an on-site specific to a more online context. Itamar, over to you.
First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm really honored to be doing this with the two of you and with the Singapore Art Museum. It's interesting, the pandemic has brought many good things and many bad things to us all. And it's interesting, we don't have the distance yet to process everything and to understand what this time will ultimately mean, what will come back to what we remember and what will never go back to what we remember and be different in both good ways and bad going forward. So I think that's an interesting perspective, just to understand we're still going through something that we're trying to understand, and everyone is sort of in a state of experimentation. But I think what the pandemic really did reveal to us is that there was a process that was already going on for many, many years that really one needs to call, and I believe in many years will be thought of as really the ultimate manifestation of the digital revolution, in a similar way to the way that we had an industrial revolution that changed society completely. When you think about it, every road in the entire world was built in the last 100 years in terms of paved roads that cars can drive on. So think of, once there's a will to go and do something and embrace and make it part of your life, we don't think of our cars as technology. We just think of it as how we move around. And it's you know, someone wise once said that a technology is not successful until it stops being a technology and starts being something that really is just the way you live your life. So it's interesting to think that the pandemic kind of pushed a huge segment of the population. There was already kind of a early adopter group, and there were people that were young and rising up in a very technological world, but the pandemic kind of took the broad breadth of society and pushed everyone into that place where it became the day-to-day activity, whether it was the way, as you know, Eng Tat is going to talk to us about, you know, medicine has changed completely, healthcare is changing completely, and every aspect, every system that we understand and live in was really designed under the industrial age. And we are now transforming each of those systems into a technological age and a digital age. And that's a process that takes some decades to actually experience that revolution. But I think that's really what we're going through. And the pandemic kind of said to us, we're here. Here we are. This is what the future looks like.
Incidentally, I was just thinking about the word programming, and programmers. And I think all of us here are programmer in one way or another. I think Itamar and myself are more closely related to cultural programming. But incidentally, Eng Tat is also a programmer, but in a very different way. Maybe you could help us understand how is programming different in your world, in the context that actually you deal with coding and stuff like that? Is that much different? How Itamar and myself actually program for cultural events and all.
Right. Well, it's really great to be on this panel along, with Itamar and Chye Hong. Right. And yeah, I think programming has a probably, I think we are looking at programming at a same and at a different angle as well. But I guess we could be using it to address similar things into building meaning, in building context and building interaction, right? And I'm engineer by training, right? And when I look at programming, it's always from the technical point of view, software programming hardware. And when I started the journey 16 years ago, working on mixed reality research, looking into connecting elderly and children through intergenerational games. And back then, you really have to explain, what kind of programming, what kind of mixed reality, what is mixed reality, right? We really have to explain from the research point of view. But I guess, over the years, the technology have evolved, and like what Itamar mentioned, the technology have to stop being a technology and have a different names, have a different meaning, a context, and it started to see a lot of manifestation of the virtual world, the mixed reality, or what we are more known today in the metaverse, right? So I think all these things are emerging, and I think to a large extent, the pandemic does indeed propel some of this advancement in a way that we are seeking for new meaning, new way to reconnect, new way to create connections and interaction between each other.
I think what is interesting is that during the pandemic, what a lot of us are doing is trying to connect with, on the culture sector, trying to connect with each other on a mental wellness context. And I think what's also quite interesting in the work that Eng Tat is doing is that he is working on digital kind of imaging, medical imaging, which is also about touching people in that sense. But the key question I want to ask, which is open to both of you, is that how can we use tech to conserve culture and help us as a human being, because we are social creature, to connect with each other? Maybe I'll start with Itamar first.
Well, it's interesting because in a way, I think people above anything else are social animals, and the pandemic really exposed how much we need each other to communicate, to be together. And the fact that we have digital communication like what we are using now gives us the possibility to actually reach people that we couldn't reach without this technology, and to have this conversation, which is really dependent on such technology. At the same time, my world in the arts has always been about people together in a room, and what that special feeling is of people together in a room. And one of the questions that I've been asking, and this was the sort of pandemic project of Decameron Row, which I put together at the early part of the pandemic, and it was really as a producer and a curator, I just missed talking and being around artists. And so a group of us came together and started reaching out to artists all over the world, very accomplished people, and saying to them, we're wondering what you're doing in there, in your isolation, in your pandemic. Send us a short video. And because people were all at home and no one had anything else to do but to be at home, we suddenly getting videos from all over the world, from all of artists from Vietnam and from, you know, many countries in Africa and in various places in Europe and throughout the United States and South America. And each person sent us a little 1-minute video of what it was that their experience was of the pandemic. And I thought, I don't know if I can share screen, but I thought I would just show you what we did is we assembled these artists from all over the world here in this kind of virtual neighborhood. And this virtual neighborhood had lots of windows in it. And each of these windows, if you scroll your mouse over it, a different name of a different artist pops up who is coming from a different country or a different place. So one is in California, one is in, you know, New York, one is in here, California again, Illinois, and so on and so forth. And here is someone in Santiago, Chile. And if you click on any one of these windows, you see the experience that person is having and that they sent us to share. And I'll click just on one to give you an example of a 1-minute video that gives this experience of the pandemic and hopefully some sense of community.
Hello and welcome to The World at One with me, Sarah Montague.
Get the idea. But the bottom line is that it was really trying to give that feeling, very simple feeling of being together with a lot of people who were sharing a very intimate experience. The site's been running for years, for about 1.5 years through the pandemic now. And it's still readily available if you want to go visit it. It was interesting because we partnered here at the bottom, if you see the share screen again, with the National Alliance on Mental Health in the shop window, with the Los Angeles Review of Books in the shop window. So we really tried to create Street Poets, which is an organization that works with homeless people and develops writing skills. So we picked, this is a food delivery organization for hunger situation in the city. So we tried really to kind of take this idea of a place, of an imaginary place that you can imagine being together with people as a way of making it feel a little bit more like you can. And it turned out that thousands and thousands, I think we've had about 50 or 60,000 visitors so far. And it's just been a really amazing thing. And then we have meetings called Meet Your Neighbors, where we invite artists who live in the same building to come to a live Zoom situation once every month and have a community that we continue that way. But it's a community that we invented. It didn't exist before everyone knew that they were somebody else's neighbor. So taking things down to these very simple, almost traditional ideas of how to organize culture, but then presenting it in a way that uses the digital technology, but feels like home. And that's what we need to work on, all of us.
I think this is really something that connects people and communities. And I think that something like that, which is kind of ground up, is very, very important. And I think at back at Eng Tat's end of the world, there is also that similar aspect of it. There is doctors are actually meeting their patients via Zoom because of the difficulty in actually getting them on site in that sense. Maybe Eng Tat can tell us a little bit about that connection.
Sure. Very interesting work that Itamar have shared. I think that's very interesting, where we can all come together in a kind of a digital environment, and how that changes the kind of a meaning and how we interact. Similarly, I think we've seen a lot of disruption and a lot of new opportunity and new way people reconnect as well in the healthcare and medical space, where, I think the emergence of a telemedicine, and more particularly in where I am, I'm in the National University of Singapore, where in the university setting, we have doctors who are looking into how they can train students more effectively in this pandemic situation. Obviously, they can't congregate in the clinics, in the hospital, in order to see the patient. There's a lack of accessibility to the actual physical environment. So we have looked into how we can use virtual reality and mixed reality to bridge this situation by creating a virtual simulated patient. So we uses AI and natural language understanding to create a form of a virtual patient that the medical students could train and interact with them and carry out like clinical assessment, physical examination. All these things can be done virtually, yet at the same space, what we call it either completely virtual environment or bringing the virtual patient into the actual clinic in creating the mixed reality environment. So it's really a kind of a fusion of something completely virtual and in the physical space itself, and creating that a training environment. So in a way, we are working with quite a few different departments from training. We work very closely with obstetric and gynecology department, for example, to train ONG students on the ONG posting on how to deliver babies through different methods, and all these are going virtual environment, but using real scenarios that is constructed based on the pedagogy. We work very closely with the medical professors to create that kind of environment, right? So this on the medical education space. I think we are looking into different kind of virtual reality, mixed reality kind of technology to kind of train the medical students. In some cases, the nurses as well. But at the same time, we also see how some of these technologies are also transforming the healthcare in a way of a more clinical practice. So I also work very closely with the National University Hospital and in part of the NUHS, National University Hospital Systems, right? So we have looking into how we can use mixed reality to bring the imaging into the actual diagnostic and also into the actual operating theater itself. Oftentimes, the imaging could happen at bedside through, say, ultrasound or through CT scans and all this. And some of these things are not able to be directly brought into the operating theater to overlay into the actual patient, to the anatomy. But with the idea of bringing glasses where, like HoloLens, a mixed reality device, we can actually overlay the hologram onto the patient, and that would help to guide certain procedures and in general improve the healthcare outcome, right? So in a way, I think the pandemic itself brought about a lot of challenges of a lot of disruptions. The doctors have to go on maybe sometimes they have to restrict their access or presence in the hospital. But then again, this kind of technology allow different doctors to be connected as well, and it allowed some of these imaging and all these things to be brought into the operating theater. So it's create different kind of tools, different kind of interaction, different kind of meaning, and yet I think propel a new kind of outcome. And I like to believe that we emerge stronger, we emerge more better outcome for the healthcare using all these technologies.
Yeah, I think what's really important and what's relevant here is that actually what we're looking at, maybe some people might be thinking like, what is that got to do with the art sectors and things like that? But then whatever that is actually being developed at your end of the world has a lot of application that actually we can rejig, reprogram in a way that it can be presented quite differently, or that the crisscross between science and art could also give us a very different sense of presence in that sense as we navigate through the digital space to get connected in that sense. I think, Itamar, you've been working on something that it's quite fabulous. It's called modulation, that I understand is something that during the pandemic, the LA Opera have actually worked on how to connect with their audience. Could you share with us a little bit about modulation with our audience here in Singapore?
Sure. Again, once we started Decameron Row, which was really a labor of love that came out of just being stuck at home, a number of our colleagues in the world of culture started seeing what we had done and thought, hey, how would this work for a museum? Or how would this work for an opera festival? And no one could do anything live in theaters because everything was closed down. So we just sort of thought, what would happen if we moved your opera festival to a digital space, an imaginary place where you can ultimately, rather than going to see a particular show, you could have access for 10 days for your ticket to see 10 premieres or 12 premieres that are all on a site that is customized for this experience. So it's almost like you have access to an experience for a limited engagement. And again, this ties in, and you'll see as I show you briefly again what it feels like, very simple in its structure, but it ties into this idea that you can maintain a continuous communication with the same audience over the digital channel and then seamlessly as they come into your place. Think of it a little bit like you talk to people on the phone that you are close to, or you text them. And those are all technological forms of communication. But then when you finally meet for dinner or they come to your house, you feel like, this is what we were trying to do. That doesn't change. When you go to a museum, you'll start by having these opportunities to have an interaction that is a digital interaction. You'll be able to see something interesting to you, look something up, show a friend a picture or something you remember. And ultimately that becomes the beginning of the relationship. And then that continues in a conversation where the exhibition and the show that Chye Hong puts on there ends up being an extension and a continuation of the community that was formed, that was interested in this. So we have to start thinking much more from the perspective of the audience and less from the perspective of the curator, much more from the perspective of the patient and less from the perspective of the doctor. And this is part of the Industrial Revolution switching over, is that it's a shift in perspective from how do you tailor something for the person who is using it, as opposed to how do you deliver it most efficiently for the system that needs to be as money saving as possible. And in a way, that's a very big shift. And if you think of how hospitals work today, I have a friend now who's in the hospital, and the inefficiency of the industrial system where you have to call nurses and the nurses are calling the doctor and the doctor is calling the nurses and no one knows who is where, and it's very busy today and you have to wait 3 more hours and there's COVID everywhere. Like, there's absolutely, it's not that that system works so well and that we feel so cared for when we enter into that system. So I think we really need to balance the realities rather than think, oh no, how can I visit the doctor on a Zoom call or in a mixed reality call, when in fact, think about what the level of medical care is most of the time when we're trying to experience or get these things. So a quick, with that prelude, a quick move to modulation, which essentially, if you paid for the ticket and got in, you would hit enter. And if you can all see the screen, you click enter and you enter the world of modulation. So you enter this kind of cavernous natural space and you have three choices: identity, fear, and isolation. If you go to fear, you enter a world that looks like this. And if you select one of the works from this, you then get the experience of a premiere video that is essentially created and premiered during the festival by Anyway, you get the idea. But this was a way, again, of transferring. And if you go here to the bottom, you can navigate to any one of the different places that you go to. But again, this time it's not a neighborhood. This time it's actually a mysterious place that we go to, and a place that feels daunting and curious making, but also a little bit unsettling. So again, an attempt to move into a digital world with a sense of bringing people to a special place that they can experience something that doesn't just feel like clicking on a video, but makes them part of something that I think is a very important tool for what is possible using technology to draw into a community.
I was thinking that actually modulation is really, really fantastic in the sense that because the sound quality is so fantastic, and it's not a simple production. It requires a lot of expertise at the back to calibrate the sound properly, to give you that sense of immersive quality. And I was wondering that for Eng Tat, who deals with mixed reality, that something like that, if we pair it with Google lenses and things like that, would that have a different sensorial view to that? And in my question to you also is high tech, low tech, or no tech. How do we, what do you think? Does it necessarily mean that high tech is always the thing to go, or sometimes low or no tech could be quite sufficient?
Well, I like to start off by answering the question by recognizing that, wow, I think I'm blown away by what Itamar has shown. It's just that everything is so beautiful, so nice, immersive, and that's the beauty of it when you're exploring, to create a meaning in a very aesthetically pleasing and environment. And I think that naturally draw the people kind of to wanted to be part of the environment, to kind of be wanting to interact, to wanted to generate conversation, generate meanings, interaction in this new environment, right? And I have to say that a lot of my work, at least in the university, in the research environment, was very much into more utility based, looking at more functional, trying to solve some problems. That's always a starting point. But I guess we could meet somewhere. I think to like how would some of this what I've shared earlier about the medical, like the use of virtual reality, mixed reality in the medical settings. How would then that inform arts or community, right? Is there? I think we are looking at essentially a different approach to look at, for example, how do we create presence, right, in this new environment, right? How do you feel that you're there? How do we create immersions, right? Although the context could be a bit different, we are looking at training doctors, to improve healthcare settings, but I think that's the fundamental. So in fact, in my research, in my lab, we also look into how do we then create natural language that that people can interact with, the AI that can understand the the questions and able to respond in a reasonable manner, right? And how do we create certain kind of animations, avatar, virtual patients to look realistic, right? That you're not talking to a robot or talking to somebody different, right? So you wanted to really create an immersive environment. Right, so I think it's important that, you know, we approach it from both utility and also the more aesthetics and level to kind of see how then we can attempt to solve that and create a platform that is meaningful. I guess whether it's the high tech, low tech, or, you know, it just have to create meaning, right? In that people wanted to use that. People need to feel that they are part of this environment. I like to draw back to one of the points that Itamar mentioned earlier about continuous communication. It's like just constant continuous communication is really important. And that by that, it means it also evolves over time. And the example that Itamar mentioned about phone, I think if you look at many decades ago, many people was like, why do you need a phone, right? You know, you can just talk to your neighbor, you can talk to people that you want, right? Why do you need a phone? But before you know, everyone had a phone and people have mobile phone and people started to talk to each other, having hours and hours of phone call. But that again, you know, it become the common way to call people. But then again, if you look at now, it's rare that people call people, right? You know, phones. I mean, if you look, I mean, for myself, you know, I used to be on a phone, say, you know, 500 minutes and a month, you know, because I'm billed by the telco on the minute, so I still remember, right, how much I'm billed for that, right? But today, you know, I barely, you know, I don't think I spend that long on the phone. You know, people are not using phone anymore. You know, we are using Zoom, we are using, you know, anything. It's like, can we meet? People assume that it's going to be like Zoom, Teams, or all these things, and it's evolving. The meaning of of course, you know, the essence that we are communicating, we need to get connected. We want to feel that we are close to each other. We are able to be immersed into the topic that we are discussing. Those doesn't change. That's continuous. But the mediums itself are changing, and you know, and I believe in the near future we all be communicating in a different environment as well. Maybe using the you know, maybe the glasses, you know, mixed reality glasses. In the form of early days, we have a Google Glass that Chye Hong mentioned. Now you have a HoloLens that's a mixed reality, and there are more glasses and devices coming out as well. So in a way, we could really see each other's hologram maybe in the near future, and we can communicate, right? So I think those are really amazing, and we just have to work together. Whether it's a low tech, high tech, you know, we are coming together to try to solve this and try to create new layers of meanings.
I think also, while technology is very, very important, and I remember a conversation with you earlier, Eng Tat, about what we call as technology. I think you rightfully mentioned that once upon a time, pen and paper are technology. The only time that I think when we don't know and what that constitute, it sounds more like so-called technology, but the moment that we have established what the use it is now something that is very, very we call it pen and paper. And so that I think that conversation was quite illuminating. Then it gets me thinking about what exactly about technology we are trying to work. And it brings me back to this idea of going back to who we are as social animals, looking at this context of us being, as I mentioned earlier, social animal, and what does it mean to be human. And going back to very, very basic is, I think, the five senses. I think, Itamar, I was intrigued when you curated the five senses festivals. I was very, very much inspired in some sense that I think how going back to the basic can illuminate and allow us to see something that otherwise have not kind of taken for granted to some extent. Maybe could you share with our audience a little bit about what were your ideas about the Five Senses Festival, and how did that transform during COVID?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, I'm happy you're going back to that point, because I think it's so critical. You know, one of the byproducts, and I hate to harp on this all the time about the industrial way of thinking, is that education and the way people learn is by sitting at desks and having a teacher and doing homework and memorizing things. And it turns out that some people learn very well that way, but a lot of people don't. A lot of people really need to learn in a different way. And when I came to start working with Pilobolus, the dance company, I realized for the first time I had come very much as a person who had always been stuck in my head, not a person who understood very much about the body. And I realized over the years working with this nonverbal art form that really expressed everything through physical movement, just how important embodiment is in everything that we do. We learn better when we can move our body, our hands, we can explain things better. And in fact, they were doing experiments where when people have to explain something and they have to sit on their hands, they can't do it. Because ultimately you need your body to be actually helping you and communicating with the people that are listening. And part of what makes Zoom so difficult is we only get the voice and the face. We're not getting all of the other information that we get when we're in a room with someone. The way their foot is jiggling or nervous, or the way they're looking to the side when they're not speaking, or each of these things contributes so much to our understanding. And so part of this idea of like, we already have text. Why does Eng Tat need to put goggles on me to go to the doctor? You know, why do I need? The truth of the matter is that part of why it's so important is because technology is now confronting this point of about embodiment and realizing that so many people understand so much better if they can actually have a three-dimensional idea of where they are in space. And I think that's a really important thing to understand, that you can't get away with all this and make culture work just with words on a page or just with pictures on the wall. You need to have some way to move through it, to be part of it. And that's, I think, what the pandemic also exposed, is how important being in the same room sometimes, or at least having the tools that you get for your five senses, that how much that contributes. And so the festival that I produced, the Five Senses Festival, was essentially looking at a top-notch arts festival, but turning everything on its head. So the Bach performance happened in front of a bonfire in the woods at midnight, with Jeremy Denk, one of our greatest pianists, performing Bach for 2 hours. And people gathered, 200 people in the middle of the woods with the fire going. The children's performances, you know, were very early in the morning, like at sunrise. And everyone got up on a lake and had to paddle a boat out to watch the performance. So the idea of the Five Senses Performance Festival was you show first-rate work, but you make everyone have a journey or an experience to get there. They don't just sit in their seat and the curtain goes up. And that became a hugely interesting sort of, for me, understanding about frame and about context. And if you frame things right, and I'm sure as a curator, Chye Hong, you understand this so deeply, if you have to frame what you're showing in the right way in order to make it engaging. And that was a huge part of what the Five Senses Festival taught me, is that engagement is not just about saying the right words or having the right ideas. It's about how you create an experience for people. And I think that's true in medicine, in science, and in all of cultural programming. I think that's going to be a very big point, because that's how you're going to, as Eng Tat says, that's how you communicate. That's how you're going to get the communication to stick and for people to actually take the medicine, believe what the doctor says, come back to the museum. All of those trust issues rely on this making sense to people. And I think that's what's very hopeful, is that we have an opportunity to really rebuild so many of the cultural institutions using the basic human values that we believe in. Those shouldn't change. The stories don't even need to change. But how we tell those stories and how we bring that culture to people is now in an opportunity where we need to take our tradition and move it into the digital world, not just think about the innovating, anarchists who are trying to create new digital possibilities, but it's now time to start moving the rest of the world into the digital world. And that's, I think, the project that Eng Tat and I are engaged in different aspects of the world, but in some way in a very similar kind of effort.
I think we at the museum, at the Singapore Art Museum, we are trying to also connect with people of all ages and background to allow them to discover contemporary art, create new memories, as well as connections, and to be inspired by different perspectives about the world that we live in, as well as the possible futures that we might be navigating into. And going back to the Five Senses Festival, I noticed that during the pandemic, when with the lockdown and all, one of the ways that you navigated around it was to introduce this idea of safari five senses, and I thought that was really, really clever in that sense. That so once upon a time, you are supposed to go there and experience the act, but with isolation, you came up with a different model. Maybe could you tell us a little bit about the safari five senses experience?
Well, as I think most of you know, for live performance and culture, the pandemic was really a disaster. I mean, not just because everything closed, but everything started to open again and then would close again and then start to open again. And just, you can imagine these poor people, we all just sat there like going, I can't believe this is happening. It's just, and then even now in New York, a huge festival just completely closed down because everyone was sick with Omicron, everyone. So it's just was really devastating. And the thought was, what can you do actually that becomes worthwhile as an art expression? So many people are locked up that have so much creativity for so long, where do we put that energy and how do we get it out? And I think in the context of live performance, since we were already working with the Five Senses Festival on a farm, I think the thought was, why don't we organize a path in the nature where people can drive their cars and they can actually have different performances placed in different places through the nature, but they come to those performances sequentially and the cars move from place to place like a station play, rather than the scenes changing and the audience staying in one place. The audience moved and the performances repeated over and over again. So this was sort of the idea of how you could get, at least it's a much smaller number, but at least you can still create an immersive experience, even if everyone's in a car. And then we broadcast on the AM radio a frequency that people could tune into and listen all to the accompanying music through their car stereo as the performance and dance was going on outside. So everyone had a soundtrack.
I think this is important because I think while we are talking about the audience's point of view, there's also the artists, the livelihood, the sector. I think what we're finding here is that many have difficulty navigating the pandemic because livelihood are challenged. And so whatever way that I think we could do to help with the recovery of the sector is very important. And I think being able to navigate around the idea of safe management measures and still be able to allow the performance to go on is really, really, I think, very, very encouraging to all in that sense. I'm going back to this idea of the senses, and I think for Eng Tat, I'm thinking like things like technology, like haptic gloves and things like that. It still go back to like even with the goggles and stuff like that. It kind of still navigates about this idea of primary our senses being primer, and I think that's is that an important aspect of that development in mixed reality that you are actually researching on?
Absolutely. I think I think for sure, it all goes back to the five senses, right? I think it definitely goes back to that. In my research, we work on a lot like hand tracking. We use glove, we uses computer visions, the cameras, to kind of track the hands and the fingers. And because we need to create a guiding hand, we need to track the performance of the, the medical students and the trainees, how they are, following the procedures. So in that aspect, we are doing, a lot of hand tracking. But of course, the holy grail is always about able to feel the virtual environment as well. If you're holding a device or the tool, or like you are able to feel that force, right? So that, that's always an area that all the researchers are still looking forward to some breakthrough, right? But definitely it all goes back to the 5 senses, go back to the fundamentals, and it's all about having a better understanding. How do we bridge the gap between the physical, and if you're doing in the virtual on a mixed reality environment, how do we bridge the gap compared to if you do it physically, right? And I really like Itamar's work in terms of how he's looking at the 5 senses festival, how you're looking to kind of reactivating the senses, right? And looking into the embodiment. I think that's fundamentally about really a deep understanding of this. How do we activate the senses and create the kind of experience, create a kind of a meaning. And I think that is amazing. And in a way, I think a lot of those we could learn from these experiences, and we can try to bring that into the digital environment and digital platforms that we are using. And the beauty about the digital platform is that we understand what is core to this in these experiences, the senses, how do we activate them, but we are able to augment many things in these digital spaces. We can augment time, we can augment space, we can augment dimensions. Quantity is not a problem. If you want to have 1,000 of these people or repeat it 1,000 times, the cost of replicating that is minimal compared to in the real world. So in a way, digital do offers a lot of different ways we can augment that, but all grounded back to the fundamental activations of the senses to create that meaning. Right, so I think there's a really strong connections, and we can learn a lot from these festivals and more traditional domain. We can actually learn that and actually recreate different kind of extension in the digital domain.
I think Itamar, going back to modulation, allow me to digress in the sense that actually when I was in conversation with you, I think I remember asking you, how did the LA Opera actually make, how do they sustain a production like that? Maybe could you just share with us how they do that for our audience who have not heard our conversation?
So the project was part of a festival called Prototype Festival, and this was sort of a special edition of that festival. And the way it was produced, and it was produced by Beth Morrison Projects, BMP, a big producer in New York. And the way it was done was by creating partnerships with a major opera company on the West Coast, a major opera company on the East Coast, and a major opera company in the middle of the country. And by then mobilizing the lists of each of those opera companies and allowing them to offer all the people that go to that are related to their particular community, this became one of the subscription options for the memberships of these various organizations. So in effect, they had a marketing access to not just the general audience, but specific communities that were already involved with the organizations that were producing. And I think that in a way, rather than selling then a ticket to a one-night performance, the tickets were then sold and they gave you almost like a little pass where you could go as many times as you want and explore the site in whatever way you wanted. You can also attach the computer to a big television with good sound system, and it's incredible. I mean, we've watched it on sort of movie theater size screens, and it's an amazing experience. But you can choose how you want to have that experience. You can sort of have that experience at home. And then once you've made that choice, then you've bought a ticket for 2 weeks, and for 2 weeks you can come back and share it. And we have very specific also tracking of how much time every person is coming, which videos they're watching the most, how long they're spending watching each video, what they, you really can learn a huge amount about what your audience is doing by giving the audience the freedom to sort of pick and choose what interests them. So it's a very good learning device as well about just understanding the relationship with the audience. But that was sort of the core process there, was to try to transfer access from ticket. Start from a theater ticket and say, instead of this theater ticket, for that money, we'll give you 2 weeks of access to something that's exclusive and a world premiere.
I think that's the beauty of that is that not only you give back to the people who are supporting, it also allows a lot of people to actually watch the performances, which otherwise, I mean, if you have a performance on site, there's just the local can be global immediately, and that probably encourages and give more people an idea of what the various opera are doing. And maybe if they happen to be at like, for example, in LA, they might want to check them out. Like right now, we might be able to check them out in this part of the world. And later on, when we do happen to be in LA, maybe we might want to go visit and really enjoy an on-site performance by them. I thought that was really, really beautiful in that sense.
I mean, think for a second, Chye Hong, about when I was a kid, we had the LP, the various records that we played the music of. And in a way, that LP was like a big marketing poster for that band. Like, so you knew there was a band in England called the Beatles, and you had the LP, or you knew there was a band called the Clash, or whatever it was, and you just dreamed about them. They were these magical creatures in some faraway country. And I think so many kids grow up with these ideas of sort of what's happening far away in Hollywood or in Paris or in, Tokyo, and everyone has these fantasies. And I think the idea of being able to actually give people, through the cultural institutions of those places, access to that thing they really want to see more of is such a gift for a kid. And when I go to that country, I'll want to go straight to that museum that taught me all those things. So I feel like you just need to find what is the hunger, and where is that thirst, and what is the kind of imagination. And that requires us to be more flexible in our thinking. And then we can really do amazing things.
Absolutely, I think so too. I'm just wondering if there's any question from the audience. And while we're waiting for audience, I was just wondering, maybe we take this opportunity. Eng Tat, do you have anything to ask Itamar, or vice versa?
Well, yeah, I really wanted to I want to say that instead of asking questions, I wanted to try them. I wanted to experience. Maybe Itamar could bring me into those experiences, and I would really love to see some of the if some. I mean, some of those digital work. I would really wanted to explore them. For some of the festivals, maybe as a kind of we would like to look at some of the some documentaries of some of these events. We'd love to really get immersed into that. Yeah.
I feel that I'm very excited just in sort of the feeling that in a way there's a merger between the projects of engineers, healthcare, and art. That's a big deal. And I think we always divide up the world: art, science, history.
Right.
And you realize those things are not so separate. It's not like all those things are totally unrelated now. And those things are shifting, and in the way that 50 years ago, someone would say, that's the subject of history. This is science. You're an artist. You don't do math. Well, it's very hard to be an artist without being able to do math today. Because you need to have engineering skills. You need to understand how to build things. I mean, you always did to a certain extent, but
yes,
you still do. And so in a way, to think that, that these things are really utilizing different stuff. I do a lot of work with MIT We met through a common friend there, Chye Hong and I. But I feel like the engineers and the artificial intelligence folks at MIT are constantly working very much similarly to artists. They want to solve a problem, they want to get something built, they don't quite know how to do it, and they get a bunch of people who work really hard to try to build it. So I think there's really an opportunity for this kind of collaboration on projects that are not specifically art projects that I think is going to be a very exciting thing that I'd love to talk more with Eng Tat about. Yeah.
Definitely. I think you hit the right word. I think we should all just come together. There should be much more collaboration, I think, to kind of create new kind of meanings, and yet, I think we are all looking at the same space, maybe from a bit different perspective. We have different experiences, but some of the, we all understand, how, math come together in some context. I think we just have to kind of collaborate, bring in some of the different experiences and create kind of a new kind of a meaning, new work. And I think that learning itself would be useful for each of the different domains. I could share a bit, I was maybe about back in the days when I was still doing my PhD, I was quite actively involved in the theater space as a technologist, right? So I'm an engineer, technologist, and I bring in a lot of sensors, variables, using cameras to track dancers' movements and all this. So in a way, I'm using technology not for this typically how we normally do in engineering to optimize certain kind of a performance, to kind of optimize for a certain function. But here is to create kind of a different kind of a meaning, to create different kind of aesthetics, create different kind of visuals. I think that itself, I learned a lot of those, and that helps me to understand my area of work as well, in terms of human-computer interaction, creating kind of a mixed reality kind of interaction that's meaningful, that could be used by the in whether it's a medical use case, for other use cases. I think those are very, very meaningful experiences. So yeah, looking forward to more collaboration. We should have more dialogue, and then hopefully some good things will happen. And
I'm going to take this opportunity to do some shameless self-promotion. Actually, one of the work that we just produced for the Singapore Art Museum at Tanjong Pagar Distripark, which is our new home before our building is ready. Actually, it's called Wanderlust at SAM, and for this particular performance, what we did, we engaged multiple artists, including actors, musicians, and dancers. And so in navigating around the different parts of our exhibition, and what they do is that they kind of interview with the artwork to some extent. But what is also quite that we are trying that is slightly different is that we have one musician in a particular gallery improvising with another musician from another gallery, and in between it crisscross with all these experiences across board. So it's a little bit like makes kind of broken radio, but what we wanted to do was to give the audience an opportunity to be very, very close to the performance, but with the social distancing in place. Because once upon a time, like for example, you might be viewing an opera singer from afar, but now he's probably like 2-3 meters away, whereby the act of him, because our new space is a kind of a warehouse converted, we have a tall ceiling. So you have an opera singer that is belting out Cantonese opera, which the projection of the voice, and you see him as kind of a human amplifier to some extent that fill up this space, and yet another musician from elsewhere kind of is listening in and trying to improvise on spot, and everything is live. But what I find that was quite interesting was that because the music were piped across all these various spaces, people didn't quite get it that actually we are doing live across board. It's all live. And the moment that they realize that, oh, it's live, then they suddenly get a very different sense of feel about the experiences about. So it's a difficult production, because trying to get the technology, the sound to work, it's not that easy. But people can still catch it tomorrow and Saturday. So so these are things that actually at our end of the world that we are trying to experiment and also give people new a new way to experience what the art can be or possibly could be. And we also celebrate this idea that how we could work with artists and collaborators, and we are always looking at how we could present the audience with something with fresh eyes to look at, whether it's our space, our gallery, or things like that. And I'm very excited about the possibility of the emergence between tech and art and science. And I think that's where, I mean, we always, one of the key person that we always think about is like Leonardo da Vinci, and then there are other artists around that plays around with, like even Kandinsky, we talk about synesthesia, and incidentally, I think Eng Tat and his and one of his students are working on a project on how to visualize to some extent that kind of synesthesia in that context. And so it's very, very exciting time. And I'm also mindful of the time. So I'm not too sure, maybe I'm thinking that we are so probably our audience needs to digest the information. That's why maybe they haven't quite asked the question. But
actually, there are, Chye Hong, sorry to interrupt. There's actually a few questions. Do you want to look at the Slido, or do you want me to?
I have, yeah. So sorry, my technology, I'm quite a techno bimbo in some sense. So it's I'm not getting any.
No problem. I can probably.
Sorry, maybe you could help me. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. I can do that now. Maybe I'll just read out a couple of the questions, and we can kind of address.
Thank you. Oh, I think I've been looking at the wrong question. Nobody's asking any questions.
Questions are coming in. So perhaps maybe I'll take this one. This interesting one. What have you learned from working in digital space that you would like to bring into in-person life experiences of art? Let me just try to put it here.
Maybe that question is open to Itamar in the sense that, that transition from on-site to online. Maybe just to repeat, what have you learned from working in the digital space that you could bring? I think for Itamar, it's the other way around. He actually worked in-person live experience and brought us back into a kind of digital world. So maybe, how then do you translate when we go back to post-pandemic? What are you thinking about post-pandemic?
Well, I mean, I think post-pandemic, the feeling is that some of the things we learned about during the pandemic, I think, are going to be tools that we're going to still want to keep using. And I think a big piece of that has to do with the fact that we're not going to go back to what we were doing before, because some things worked extremely well and some things worked extremely badly, and we need to build and make sure that we have ways to go around that as also. But I think it's very important for us to see that a lot of life has changed over this time. And so I think from an artistic point of view, I would say what I'm most interested in now, and this is really, I think, a global change, is that rather than art being sort of curated from top down, we need to find a way that the participation in art is something that involves people at all levels having a sense of contributing something, which means that much more in the digital world, you realize that in order to give people an experience, they need to participate. And participating means writing something, asking a question, contributing something, sending their own video, putting something of themselves into the middle of the pile and saying, this belongs to all of us. We're starting a project at MIT now that's a garden, a virtual garden that stands in the middle of a big Frank Gehry lobby where people come in the morning. But everyone who waits for the elevator can participate in answering questions that help the garden grow. And so using the virtual method and using the digital technology, we're actually trying to create more of a feeling of people coming to a live space but having something that they can leave, answering a question, answering a riddle, and that together all of the hundreds of people that ride the elevator are also growing a garden and nourishing a garden. So this is an example of just taking into the live performance space the idea that people don't just come to watch passively, but they must participate actively and make their own choices about participating or not participating. And that's a big difference. We used to say, buy a ticket, now sit in your chair is nailed to the floor, and you can't leave until it's over. So I feel like that's a new reality. People don't like to be trapped into their chair so much anymore. And so we do all of these things in a different setting, but there is a way to translate this, and there is a way to keep people being involved in live experience. But there's also an understanding that I think a lot of us as curators can take to heart, which is we've thought very much, here's my idea about this artist. I'm going to make an essay, and then I'm going to hang the paintings, and it will be my creation. That's the show. As opposed to really trying to understand every show should begin with some kind of a community that you're trying to speak to. And how do you get that community involved, whether it's because they all love the artist or because they all have a common experience or they all share a religion or a history or whatever it is, you need to understand what's the glue that every show in a museum is holding its community with. And that's a new way of thinking that I think I learned a lot from trying to organize community digitally.
The next question, I think, probably is to Itamar. What advice would you give young cultural programmers?
I would simply say to find the people who you believe are doing the best cultural programming that you can find in the world, and reach out to them and spend as much time learning or connecting with them. I once had a very wise friend, a writer, who said to me, the only way to really get a job is you should find out who you admire the most and then spend as much time as close to them as possible, and everything else will work itself out. Yeah. So I think I would really just figure out who's doing something that you admire, and then try to reach out to that person. It's amazing how open people are, especially nowadays, when I think one of the great benefits is that it's possible now to reach people directly, whereas before they had a big office, there's no office anymore. So there's much more kind of access in a way that I think has been very interesting.
I think just to add, internship is excellent as well. I think many of us ventures into the museum world or in the culture sector in some sense is through internship as well. And I think personally, I stepped into the door of a museum. I never really wanted to get out, and I'm very, very much enriched by the kind of work that I get to do. And so it's amazing. It's not, but it's also a curse in some sense, because I can't quite demarcate between my personal life and my work life in that sense. But never a dull moment in the context of in those of us that are navigating the arts and culture sector. The other question that is here is that what do you miss the most about life experiences of art?
Boy, I'll tell you, I went to a play the other night, and everyone was so happy to be in the theater. The play was fine. It wasn't that good, but it was so nice to be in the theater. People were just giddy. It was like we were like 8-year-olds. Everyone was sort of like excited and wearing their mask and waiting for the show to begin, and the lights went down and everyone started clapping before anything happened. And it was just sort of this memory of being together and it was almost like a family dinner. I didn't know any of the people there, but it was really just this feeling of like, wow, we're all in a room again. And it was a very joyous feeling, and it made me very convinced at how powerful just being in a room can be. And I think, we also have to think your museum is now one of the places that's one of the biggest buildings in town, and People used to gather in churches. People used to gather. I mean, there's a lot of the areas of life in offices and churches that has been interrupted. And so in a way, culture and museums, I think, need to take on some of that role in providing a place for families to be able to pass on tradition and to pass on history. And I think that the museum being a setting that kind of encourages that kind of generational transfer is a very important role that used to be done in other kinds of institutions. And I think now is more and more in the domain of culture for us to figure out how to get those stories told.
Sorry, there was a little bit of lax time. I'm mindful of the time. So in hindsight, could I get you to share, both of you, maybe Eng Tat first instance, to share with us is your key takeaway for our audience tonight? Eng Tat, over to you.
Right. So I think we discussed a lot of things about how the pandemic has shifted a lot of, created a lot of inconveniences and a lot of disruptions, I guess, in our lives, in a lot of activities, and in terms of the art space, a lot of disruptions in terms of performances and all this, right? And in my case, in the research as well, I think there's a lot of disruption into a certain way how, for example, educations being carried out, how do we train people, right? But at the same time, that also let us reevaluate, our understanding of various different kind of tools, and how we can actually look into enhancing our own life and creating meanings at the same time. Because I mean, we have, like Itamar mentioned, we have all our senses, and it's called to us, and we kind of interacting with the world through our senses, but through different kind of tools and interacting with other people, right? So that kind of re-understanding of that tool and what are the emerging digital platforms, digital devices, things like, for example, virtual reality, mixed reality, haptics, virtual interactions, all these things are emerging, and they could provide a different kind of context or meaning to our work as well. Whether you are a researcher, you are in a medical field, you are an artist, I believe that a lot of this technology could be very interesting. And it could be a new form, for example, how we could use mixed reality, virtual reality into performances spaces, and we kind of use that to kind of create, deeper meaning. In a sense, we still have to look back into how do we create presence, how do we create immersions. We can't run away from the fundamentals, but we can relook into some of these digital tools as a way of an enabler for us to relook into this, creating new kind of meanings. So in a sense, I think that one key, takeaway is that I guess it's about getting ourselves exposed to the tools, get to know more. I think we need to collaborate more between artists and engineers and technologies, and then together perhaps we'll create new kind of tools, platforms, and new kind of meaning that we'll all enrich our own lives, our own understanding of whichever respective fields we come from.
I think for me, it's pretty simple, which is, the first thought that comes to mind is just, boy, we have a lot of work to do. There's a lot that really needs to be done. And it's interesting because sometimes you feel like more and more, but you feel like half of the world still feels like, what are you talking about? Everything's fine. It's all okay. We just need to go back and do what we did before and just do more of that. And it's okay. It's not perfect, but nothing's perfect. And then half the world sees, wait a minute, so many of these systems just really need to be rethought. And once they are, it'll be more efficient, it'll save money, and it'll add value and meaning to people's lives in a way that will allow culture to take a more critical role, rather than to feel like culture is something that's slowly getting outdated and replaced by video games, which is just a very silly assumption of mistrust to our younger generation. Those people are all going to want to have story and tradition and meaning in their lives. And in fact, have formed a kind of community online in those games that is something that is quite amazing. So, that's the takeaway, that I think there's a lot to do, and that I hope that people start to see how many of these projects are worth redesigning, because they will improve the experience for so many aspects of society.
And I also think that this is also about supporting the artists, and anything that we do at this point in time, I think it's really, really important. And I think the arts have a wonderful way to alleviate anxiety and help us to have a better wellness to some extent. And with that note, thank you so much, Eng Tat. Thank you so much, Itamar, for spending time with us to share and with your very, very rich experience with our audiences. Later on, I asked the organizer to help us to put up a slide which has all the links to the various case study that we talked about. And with that note, thank you very much. Maybe a virtual clap for our speakers, Itamar, before I hand over to Nadia. Thank you so much. Big thank you.
Thank you guys. Thank you so much. And thank you, Eng Tat. It was a real pleasure, and I hope we continue our conversation.
Definitely. Thank you, Chye Hong. Thank you, Itamar. I really enjoyed myself.
Thank you, Chye Hong, as always. Yeah.
Thank you. Nadia, over to you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful conversation, Chye Hong, Itamar, and Eng Tat. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure our audiences did as well. And I do hope we get to meet in person before long. For now, if you'd like to find out more about all the talks happening for SAW Dialogues 2022, some in person and some online, please scan the QR code on the screen now. All recordings of the past panels are available for viewing on SAW Digital. Do also look out for the summaries of each panel that will be released on artandmarket.net, where we share key takeaways. Before you go, we would like to invite you to complete a survey towards improving the program for the next Singapore Art Week. I'll give you a moment to scan yet another QR code on screen. When you have completed a survey, you can take a screenshot of the submission page and show it at Gilman Barracks at the info booths at blocks 9 and 47 to collect complimentary SAW 2022 merchandise. SAW Dialogues 2022 is presented by Art and Market in partnership with National Arts Council Singapore. See you at the next talk. Have a good evening. Bye.
Could you share the slide, please? Thank you.